Hey Terra friends, it's Dustin from Modern Metaphysicae, and today I thought we could hang out and take a trip through my favorite Retro Rider based decks. So these are decks that are not Pixie's artwork, but they are inspired by, most of the time very heavily, by Pixie's artwork. There was just this really interesting thing that happened, early on in the tarot, where a lot of people didn't really reinvent the tarot as we see today. They took existing decks like the RWS and refashioned them and tried to quote unquote fix the problems that were with it, right? We saw that very famously with, the Albano Waite deck that Frankie Albano basically went back in and recolored the RWS. Now, this is a kind of an honorary mention because it does use Pixie's line art. It just was recolored. So I didn't want to specifically include it in this review, but it definitely gets a little bit of an honorary mention. If you are new to my channel, thank you for coming by and checking out the channel. If you are returning, thank you so much for all of your love and support. I really appreciate it. As always, I'll put the names and creators of these decks down in the description box below for you to check out. And as always, you'll find down there all of my social media links and links to my personal website where you can book a reading with me if you're interested in that. So let's dive into these because I love me some old decks, specifically old Rider decks. I learned tarot on the RWS system and very quickly grew my appreciation for Pixie's artwork and Arthur Edward Waite's sort of esoteric work that he did and a lot of his writing early in my own tarot journey. And so when I started really collecting decks, one of the things that really grabbed my attention was all of these different variations on the classic Rider Waite Smith deck. And so I've always been enamored by these kinds of decks, and I finally just recently got a hold of one that I've been looking for a couple years now, which is the J.K. Waite Tarot. Now, this is the only deck of all of these that I have done a full review on, so if you're interested in that, I will put a link up in the cards here. It'll pop up and you can check out that review. But this deck was published by a company called Teraiku Shobo, I believe is how you say that. I'm not entirely sure. It's the bottom text there. It was published in Japan and is what is considered widely to be regarded as the first sort of widely published mass market tarot deck in Japan. And it's called the J.K. Waite because the creator was known as the Jupiter King. His name was Jupiter King, was kind of like his pen name. So it's known as the J.K. Waite Tarot. And it was published in 1975. And it's really cool. Some of the things about it are obviously like the pentacles are these really bold pentacles. You get these beautiful, really retro feeling cards and color and things like that. Obviously, it follows very much the tradition of Pixie's design, but is, obviously redrawn and reinterpreted. And you can see where the creators of this deck specifically were trying to address some of the, color associations and more esoteric associations and things like that, which is really interesting and really, really great. I did notice too, a lot of the figures, especially in the major arcana, kind of almost lean back towards Marseille traditions and things like that. But it's really great the way they have kind of reinterpreted this version of the classic RWS Tarot. I love this Two of Swords. But this has been kind of one of my holy grail decks, per se, when it comes to retro classic vintage decks that I just absolutely adore and love. I mean, the big thing about a lot of these decks, right, is that they're not computer generated or photoshopped, right? These are handmade in a sense, right? Hand colorized, whether it be through lithography or whatever. There's a number of methods that are used in these decks that I'm presenting today. And there's something just really magical about that to me. I find myself struggle more often than not with highly digital or digitized art decks, more often than not with more modern style decks. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to these. And specifically with the retro style decks, I just love the coloration. So that's the JK Waite. Again, I have done a full review of just this one, and I will make sure that link is in the cards for you, and I'll put it down below as well. So that's the first. Now, speaking of this deck, when I did the review of this and talked about this on the Three Fat Readers channel, which is a collaboration channel that I participated in with Lisa from Supportive Tarot and Danny from Danny Mystic, there's a link to that down below as well. Check it out. I talked about it in comparison to this deck, which is the Thompson Leng deck. Now, this is not an original deck. This is a facsimile deck that I believe is still available from tarotcollectibles.com, but it seems like they've kind of shut their website down for the time being during this whole pandemic thing. So you may not be able to get it right now, but it does seem like they're gonna reopen. This is a really hard to find deck. All of these are pretty difficult to find. As long as you're patient, you can probably find them, especially this one in particular, and even this one to some extent. But this one in its original condition is nigh impossible to find, and the price is just as ludicrous. But when I found out that there was this facsimile of it, I was super excited about that, and I grabbed it as soon as I could. So this deck is really beautiful. This is actually the oldest. It is not technically a retro deck, even though it has very retro colors. It was first originally published in 1935, and it was published by a women's magazine in the UK, which I just thought was really fascinating and interesting. But as you can see, it's a very small deck. I believe it's bridge size. It's slightly smaller than a playing card. And the artwork is just it's really interesting. You can really see the 30s style in this sun card with the two clothed solar twins. But it's really interesting to see how they reinterpreted things. Now there's some odd elemental association shifts with this deck that trip a lot of people up. The cups are often associated in this deck with air, and the swords are often associated with water. Now, I haven't been able to do a ton of research into original source material as far as interpretations of that is concerned. There is a PDF that is available through Tarot Collectibles that gives you some insight into that, but it's one of those things that I just thought was really fascinating and interesting. And as you can see, the cards definitely still have very similar imagery, but they lean towards the air element, which I just thought was really fascinating. And then when we get to, although the cups, the King of Cups is still in his big old ocean platform, and then the element of earth is still very present in the Pentacles suit. Again, very traditional RWS imagery and depictions. And then when we get to swords, we can see there's a lot more water present in swords. The Three of Swords is really interesting. It's more like the Three Musketeers, right? And the Four of Swords, we have more of that sort of conflict as opposed to the Five of Swords, which is really interesting. So there's some changes in here that are distinctly different than the RWS. Some things were quote unquote fixed. which I thought was really interesting. This Ten of Swords is always fascinating to me with this giant bat figure nightmare thing. I love this Knight of Swords wading through the river. But very interesting, you know, you have the moon associated there, things like that. Of course, fire in the wands still. And I think it's so interesting too that of all of the suits in this deck, they chose to have wands lean more towards the traditional Golden Dawn depictions than the RWS, which I just thought was really fascinating. And then in the back here, they've included some of the original text and sort of things included with the deck. This is not a deck that I've spent a ton of time with. It's relatively new to my collection, and it's one that I want to do more specific like source research into to really get a strong understanding of those changes that they made and why they made them and things like that. But this is the oldest of all of those kind of retro style decks, and I really love it. And it's interesting to me because I saw a lot of parallels between this deck, its color choices and things like that, and the JK Waite, which just made me, you know, interested in how much this deck may have influenced some of these 70s deck creators, being that it's from 1935. So that is the Thompson Leng. Now let's talk about this one. So this is one of my favorite retro decks. This is the Tarot of the Ancient Prophecy, which was published in 1973. The whole point of this deck, again, was a lot like the Albano Waite, where it was sort of a redoing of Pixie and Arthur Edward Waite's RWS Tarot. As you can see, a lot of the card design and sort of imagery and composition and things like that are the same. Obviously, the colors are different, right? We have this very sort of blood orange sky here with our Fool, but we still have a lot of the same symbolism, right? He still has his white rose, the dog's still there, etc., etc. Now, the thing that I love about this deck in particular is that the art style, there's something childlike about it. And it's very clear, it's very, you know, not full of esoteric symbolism and things like that. It's just very kind of distilled, I think is the word I would use to describe it. And I really enjoy that. I'm not entirely sure what media they used for this. It seems like pen and ink along with maybe some gouache. But it gives us this really unique style. I always found it interesting that this magician has no table and that the earth is his table. But yeah, it's really fascinating how distilled down they created this artwork and how simplistic it is, but it still conveys all of the same things that we see in so many decks today, which I thought was fascinating. And you see that in a lot of these 70s decks where they kind of just simplify things and then they adjust some of the colors and symbolism and things to give it more of, I love the background on this 5 and this, oh, it's so beautiful. I think this might be watercolor, in fact. But it's so unique. And the thing I think that draws me the most to these kind of decks is, again, the hand-drawn artistic quality of them. There's something about it that I just really love. Now, that's not to say that digital art just doesn't at all do it for me. Really well done digital art I love as well, but this is just really fantastic, and it's just so evocative in the sense of its simplicity, which I think is just really unique, and you don't see a lot today in more modern tarot decks. I love that the Knight of Pentacles is riding away from us. It's just, you know, there's a lot of very conscious choices being made in this deck, which I think is fantastic. So this, again, is the Tarot of the Ancient Prophecy. The backs have these great sort of burning cross emblems on them. This is obviously a very well-loved, very well-worn deck. Now, the next deck I want to talk about is the Royal Fez Moroccan Tarot. This is probably one of the oldest in my vintage tarot deck collections. And when I first saw this deck, I saw it, I think, on an Instagram post, and I instantly fell in love with the imagery. It reminded me so much of line cut etchings that I just fell in love with when I was in art school and studying art history, that I had to find this deck. And when I went looking for it, of course, it's one of those vintage decks that's really hard to find, and when it is available, it's usually astronomically priced. But I found this copy, which had no guidebook and no box, very affordably one day while perusing the depths of eBay, and snagged it, and I'm really happy about that. Now, ironically enough, I did actually pick up a copy later, just a few months ago, with the box and the guidebook, when I found this, again, just being patient, checking on things on eBay, for a very affordable price. And with any of these decks, people always ask me, how do you find them? I set up searches on eBay, and I check them every once in a while, and I look at, other things like Etsy, and I just keep an eye out for things. And that's how I find them. I'm just patient. If I see one, I don't immediately always jump on it, especially if it's some astronomical price. So keep that in mind if you are looking for vintage out-of-print decks. It is a game of patience more than anything else. But this one, I love the backs. The backs are so retro and so fun. Now, this deck was originally published, I believe, this is a 1970, I believe it was 1972. I can't remember exactly. But the interesting thing about this deck is that it was first published by the founder of Mensa, which, if you're not familiar, Mensa's like this sort of like Brainiac Club, I guess is the best way to put it. It's an organization for people who have high IQs, essentially. So I believe it's over 170. But this deck was created kind of to address some issues and fundamental symbolism and mistranslations or interpretations of the tarot when it was created. Now, the fascinating thing about this deck, the thing that fascinated me the most, was that they kept a lot of the symbolism and elemental associations with the suits, but each suit also represented sort of a class of people, right? And I thought that was really intriguing. So the swords kind of represent the upper class or aristocratic sort of levels of society. The wands represent the lowest peasantry levels of society. The cups represent religious sort of figures, or that spiritual strata in society. So clergy, priests, nuns, monks, all of that kind of ideas, right? And then the pentacles or the coins represent the working class, the middle class, the merchants, the tradesmen, the businessmen, all of that kind of stuff. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of take on the classic tarot, and how incorporating this class system into the deck was really fascinating. But this deck is really beautiful. It does really very much follow the traditional RWS structure in terms of imagery, in terms of iconography, meaning, and things like that. But as you go through the deck, you can see some of the associations with those things, right? With the class system being present and things like that. And the pentacles here, we have, obviously a wealthy merchant giving out alms to the poor. It's a really beautiful deck. I love the simple color palette, the use of black and white in a lot of the backgrounds. It really draws your attention to the details that it's, the card is telling you to focus on. I love the angle of this nine of swords. You really get the idea that it really is, in her head, right? A lot of people say those swords are on a wall. They're not really on a wall, right? They're representative of the nightmares and anxieties and doubts, fears, and all of that we have. Such an interesting devil card. But it's a really, really stunningly beautiful deck. Again, this idea of sort of tarot distillation, distilling it down to its key elements, drawing focus to specific things, and quote unquote fixing, some of the mistakes that were made by earlier deck creators, I just think it's really fascinating and really interesting. And it follows so well to the traditional RWS depictions, obviously, right? But at the same time, it still is kind of its own thing, which I think is really interesting. I love this High Priestess card. I love that the Fool is focused on this butterfly, and that's kind of the distraction that's leading him off the cliff. You still have the dog. It's just, there's so much in these cards, which is really unique, but at the same time, really traditional, which I love. I love the dichotomy there in these vintage decks that you don't see that a lot anymore in a lot of modern decks, which is kind of disappointing, which I think is why I'm so drawn to vintage tarot. I love the lemniscate in his around his wand, right? That symbol of infinity and cycles and things like that around the wand, which, again, you still have that nod to the as above so below gesture, right, with his finger, but it's just so interesting. One of my favorites. This is absolutely one of my favorite decks, and I'm so glad I have two copies, because this has become my go-to for use deck, right? I read with this deck all the time. I do client readings with this deck all the time. It's a beautiful deck. So that, again, is the Royal Fez Moroccan Tarot. And then last but not least, we have what is probably the first vintage deck that ever really kind of caught my attention a while ago. And that is what is affectionately called the Hoi Polloi, or the Reese Games Tarot. And this deck screams the 70s, which I absolutely adore. It was published in 1973. Again, you have a reinterpretation of Pamela Coleman Smith's artwork, and it is deliciously the 70s. So you get these great little blank cards that come with it, but the artwork is so 70s. It's amazing, and I just adore this deck. Now, interestingly enough, this was a very mass market deck. I'm pretty sure this deck remained in print up until the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And there are several different boxes that this deck comes in. This edition that I got was in pristine condition. I'm fairly certain that this deck sat unused in someone's drawer for I don't know how many years. The edition, I bumped the camera, sorry. The edition that I have is from 1973, and it comes in this large purple box. At least the copyright says 1973. I'm not entirely sure when this edition was exactly produced. See, the copyright inside the box says 1972, which is interesting. So the box says 1973, the book says 1972, but it's in wonderful condition, and it's just such a unique deck. The coloration, the iconography, again, this really sticks to the RWS design aesthetic, but again, it's very distilled down. I love the rainbow in this 10 of Cups, right? It's so amazingly the 70s, and I love it. It's just so fantastic. The color choices, like this, I don't know, lime, this, I swear to God, this green color is still in my grandmother's kitchen. Not even joking. It's like browns and greens. It's wonderful. But yeah, they're really great decks, and I really appreciate the artwork and the time it took, especially back in this period, to create these things. And there's something about that. There's something about the creation of them in this context that I think adds to the whimsical nature of them, almost the magical quality of them. So again, that is the Polloi. So those are some of my favorite retro rider based decks. Obviously there's tons of other retro decks that I have that are not rider specific interpretations. But let me know in the comments below which one of these was your favorite. If there is a specific deck here that I showed today that you are really, really, really interested in checking out and getting a full review on, let me know in the comments below too. Again, the only one I've done a full sort of walkthrough and review of is the J.K. Waite Tarot. So keep that in mind. And again, that link will be in the description box and in the cards for you. So I hope you enjoyed this little stroll through some of my favorite retro rider inspired decks. I would love to hear what you think about these decks in the comments below. If you have one, let me know how much you love it, or maybe not love it. And I hope all of you are well and happy and safe and healthy during this crazy time that we're all living in. And I hope that you all have an amazing, amazing day. So as always, remember, everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind, always. Bye, everybody.